Inference Plus Story Short number 29, Series A. Wendell had never considered himself a particularly environmentally conscious sort of guy, but he did his best to reduce, reuse, and recycle within reason. He carried a hydro flask. He recycled tomato sauce cans, provided they wouldn't take too long to rinse out. Yes, sometimes he let the water run while he brushed his teeth, but he avoided plastic straws whenever possible for the sake of the sea turtles. He was just an average guy, making his way through the world and making reasonable efforts not to burn it all down in the process. It was a Thursday in early June, and Wendell, who taught history at the junior high, was in the process of recovering from the final weeks of another school year. It had rained that morning, the kind of deep, drenching shower that pops up out of a sunny sky with startling abruptness, then blows away just as quickly. He opened the bedroom window to enjoy the fresh air before the day turned too hot, and settled into his favorite book chair to enjoy a mystery novel that was totally inappropriate for seventh graders. Just as the unknown killer raised the knife above their doomed victim, a low buzz crept into the periphery of his awareness. Assuming it was a phone notification, he sighed and dug into his pocket. However, no text or email had been received. Still, the hum continued. Wendell stood up and looked around for the source of the sound, finally settling his eyes on the windowsill. There, lying in a puddle of rainwater, lay the tiniest of bees. Wendell shrieked. His father would have said he shrieked like a girl, but Wendell didn't buy into that sort of misogyny. He himself might have said he shrieked like a small child, but semantics weren't at the forefront of his mind at that moment. Grasping the mystery novel in both hands, he raised the volume above his head and prepared to dispatch the offending insect. Just as he was about to bring the book down on the drowning bee, a news story about the importance of bees and their unfortunate decline in numbers flashed through his mind. He set the book down gently on the nightstand and decided that he was capable of a small act of mercy for the good of the planet and the cleanliness of his soul. Still, a bee sting was an unpleasant thing, and he would do his best to avoid it. After carefully considering the best course of action, Wendell developed a plan with a low level of risk for a high level of reward. He put on the pair of thick leather work gloves he'd purchased last fall to use while pruning the rose bushes. Gathering up a pair of barbecue tongs and a lidded butter dish, he approached the struggling creature warily. "Easy, little guy. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to get you out of that water." This proved to be easier said than done. The thick gloves made Wendell's hands clumsy, and the barbecue tongs were far too large to pick up the tiny bee without crushing it. After several failed extraction attempts, he noticed that the bee's movements were slowing and the buzzing had ceased. It was dying. No longer concerned about the possible sting, Wendell uncharacteristically threw caution to the wind. Pulling the gloves from his hands, he threw them and the useless tongs to the floor. Fearing the worst, he reached out a timid thumb and forefinger. Then, ever so gently, he pulled the bee from its watery grave and placed it in the palm of his hand. Now that it was actually there, he felt his apprehension subside. It was so tiny and so helpless. Its black and yellow fuzz looked like the fur of a wet dog, and Wendell thought he saw the poor thing shiver. The wings, also wet, flicked uselessly, helplessly, and he sensed the tiny panic rising from its body. "Hey there," he said softly. "You're going to be okay. You just need to dry out a little, then you'll be out there flying around again, okay?" Wendell was certain the bee had nodded, a nearly imperceptible yes. At the very least, it had stopped the frenzied fluttering, and now merely flicked its wings experimentally from time to time to see if they had dried. Still cupping the fragile bee, Wendell made his way onto the patio. He sat in a deck chair in the warm sun and regarded his tiny companion. It was buzzing again, which aroused both relief and anxiety. If the bee was buzzing, it was recovering. If the bee was buzzing, it might now turn on him, inject its stinger into his naked palm, and send him into paroxysms of agony. The bee did not seem to register Wendell's internal conflict, and simply crawled amiably around on his hand, waiting for its wings to dry. It was, Wendell had to admit, kind of cute, and the way it waggled its antenna was surprisingly enchanting. After a while, it simply flew away with a gesture that looked like a tiny wave. Wendell smiled with satisfaction at a good deed done and was pleased when the bee didn't stray far, landing on a nearby nasturtium. Wendell went inside to retrieve the mystery novel and was doubly pleased to see that the bee, who he had begun to think of as Delilah and not merely the bee, remained prettily atop the nasturtium. He read, and Delilah lounged in companionable silence for the better part of an hour before Wendell began to feel thirsty. Marking his page in the mystery novel, he stood to go inside to fetch a glass of cold lemonade from the refrigerator. Delilah, buzzing in the friendliest sort of way, followed behind him like a miniature retriever. Well past the point of feeling anxious around Delilah, who was now not simply a stinging menace but an acquaintance, Wendell smiled at his guest. "I'm just off to fetch a glass of lemonade," he explained, feeling a little silly, "but I'll be right back out in a minute." This seemed to content Delilah, who landed on top of the handrail post, adopting the patient demeanor of an old woman waiting for the bus. When Wendell returned with the lemonade a few minutes later, she followed him back to the deck chair, this time perching herself on a gladiolus only a few feet from where he sat. His earlier fear of bees now all but vanished, at least insofar as this specific bee was concerned, and he resumed his reading. After a time, Delilah came and landed atop the book as he read. "Yes?" he asked, bemused. She flew over to the half-drunk glass of lemonade and buzzed around the top of the cup. "Looks like somebody wants some lemonade," Wendell laughed. "I'll tell you what, I'll put a little drop on the picnic table so we can share it. Deal?" Delilah eagerly flew to the picnic table, which Wendell found a delightful coincidence. Then, true to his word, he brought over the glass of lemonade, dipped his finger into the sticky drink, and deposited several fat drops in a tiny pool on the table. Delilah crawled to the pool and began to drink, her tiny proboscis dipping with ladylike daintiness into the sweet liquid. "You were thirsty," he exclaimed, taking another long swallow himself. The morning cool had begun to burn away beneath the hot summer sun. Wendell felt the air conditioning beckoning him back indoors. Not wanting to leave Delilah without a few polite parting words, he paused at the back door. "So, it was nice spending the morning with you," he said awkwardly, like a man uncertain how to say goodnight after a date. "I'm gonna go inside now. Maybe catch a nap. Glad I was able to help you out, and I liked hanging out, so see you around?" He opened the door. Delilah buzzed past him and hovered in the entryway. Wendell sensed that he had come to a crossroads. The common sense thing to do would be to shoo the insect out the door into the backyard, make himself a bologna sandwich, then take a pleasant nap. That would most certainly have been the normal, logical, sensible thing to do. But a more whimsical, less sensible part of him wondered, what if? What if he closed the door behind him and allowed Delilah to stay inside? It was so hot. She might be dehydrated from her ordeal. Could bees get heat stroke? It seemed a valid concern. After all the effort to revive her, it would be silly, criminal, to turn her out now, when there was an excellent chance she was still recovering from her ordeal. He closed the door. "I guess you can stay." Delilah buzzed about him with what could only be described as joy. Surely a bee couldn't experience joy, could it? She landed gently on his nose, like a kiss. Wendell closed his eyes and let the soft thrum tickle his face. It was very pleasant. There was a knock at the door. Both bee and man startled. "I'd better get that." Wendell's cheeks were already flushed when he opened the door and saw Eliza Somerset, who taught 7th grade math 3 classrooms down at the junior high, awkwardly balancing a large cardboard box on one hip. When Wendell regarded the hip and mentally noted how soft and shapely it was, the flush became a full-on reddening as his cheeks turned the fiery red of summer cherries. Miss Somerset, Eliza, had been the object of Wendell's secret desire from the very first time he'd seen her balancing an equation at the dry erase board the September after he'd been hired. He had made a few subtle attempts to express his romantic inclinations, but so far she'd been either unaware or unreceptive. He wasn't sure which, but now she was here, standing on the front porch. "Wendell, are you going to let me in?" Eliza asked, exasperated. She gestured hastily with her free hand. "I got this for you. It weighs a ton, and I don't entirely trust the bottom of this box." "Oh, yes, of course, come in." He held open the screen door, and Eliza came inside. She went right to the kitchen table and plunked down the box. "Whew, made it." She regarded Wendell and cocked her head to one side. "You're red as a beet, Wendell. Too much sun?" "Yes," he said, relieved to have a viable reason for the color of his face that wasn't an admission of intense attraction. "I should have put on sunscreen." "No kidding." "Well, what's in the box?" he asked. "Oh, yeah, the thing I got for you," she laughed. "It's for your classroom. I saw it at the garage sale and remembered how you said the kids didn't know what a globe was in class last year, so I got it for you for your classroom. It's a nice one, I think." It really was a nice globe, even if Istanbul was still identified as Constantinople and Thailand was labeled as Siam. "I can't believe you remembered that," he said. "Thank you. It's really beautiful and old. It'll look good on my desk, and now the kids will know what a globe is." They smiled at one another. Wendell had utterly forgotten about his recent lunch with Delilah. Delilah, however, had not, as evidenced by the enraged buzzing in his left ear. "Oh!" Eliza exclaimed. "A bee! There's a bee by your ear!" Eliza swatted. Delilah dodged. Eliza picked up a grocery flyer from the kitchen counter and rolled it up. "Wait!" Wendell cried. "That's not a—" But it was too late. An assertive smack against the kitchen cupboards. A squelching sound that sent a ripple of nausea through Wendell's gut. "Got it,"